It only took Abraham Lincoln a couple of minutes to deliver the Gettysburg Address, but almost every teacher that I know finds it impossible to talk about the Gettysburg Address in just 2 minutes. There's just so much packed in to this prose poem about American history. So let me try to be brief, but I'll start with something that's obvious, which is when you think about the Gettysburg Address, you need to focus on the author and the audience. In this case, the author is the President of the United States in the fall of 1863, speaking at the dedication of the Soldiers' National Cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It's months after the great battle of the war, but the war continues. And in the fall of 1863, the election season, the state election season, has passed, and now people are anticipating the upcoming presidential and federal elections in 1864, and they need to hear from the president about how to endure in the war. Now, the audience at the cemetery, over 10,000 people, had come to see the dedication of this sacred place, but I think the audience that Lincoln was intending to reach is much broader than that. The reading audience of the North in particular, who are wondering what will happen in the upcoming year and who will lead the ship of state. Now, when you begin this address, of course, the opening is so famous, 4score and 7, but any good student must realize that did not come to Lincoln out of the blue, and it wasn't something that came easily to him. In fact, there is a kind of rough draft opening for the Gettysburg Address after the victory at Gettysburg and after the news had reached Washington that literally at the same time the Union troops had prevailed in Pennsylvania, the Confederate stronghold on the Mississippi at Vicksburg had fallen, the last Confederate stronghold on the river. The news compelled the president to speak off the cuff, extemporaneously. It's called a response to a serenade that Lincoln offered in July of 1863. And this is what he said. He said, "How long ago is it, 80-odd years, since on the 4th of July, for the first time in the history of the world, a nation by its representatives assembled and declared as self-evident truth that all men are created equal." Think about that opening, and then compare it to the biblical certainty of the opening a few months later at Gettysburg on November 19th. 4score and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Same idea, different prose. The uncertainty of the initial response to the victories, how long ago is it, has now become the biblical certainty. This is the example that we can use best to show a writer revising. And what Lincoln is doing here with his metaphors, our fathers who brought forth a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, is a concept of organic birth, a living nation built around or created around its ideals. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, Lincoln writes, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. Not the great battlefield, but a great battlefield. Lincoln, as much as he respected the sacrifices at Gettysburg and as much as he appreciated the triumph, he also considered it to be a missed opportunity, and he was worried that the Union Army had not managed to capture Lee's army after Gettysburg. He says, "We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that the nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this." Simple language, simple structure. Lincoln began in the past, he's now switched to the present, and he will end his speech in the future. He writes, "But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here." Everyone always comments about how untrue that was. Of course, we have long noted what Lincoln said there on that day. And I think Lincoln suspected that might be true, but he was using a framework as a reminder to the people who would be reading this speech of their remaining work. And this is what he is going to describe next. He says, "It is for us the living rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced." This might be the thesis sentence of this short speech. The unfinished work is what Lincoln is focusing his audience on and what he's reminding them they must accomplish. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion, that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Now this closing is full of echoes and references that sometimes can be lost to the modern audience, but were alive for the audience of 1863. For example, that ending, government of the people, by the people, for the people, that was a conscious paraphrase of a very famous speech by Daniel Webster, the senator from Massachusetts who in 1830 gave what was perhaps the most famous speech in 19th century America before the Gettysburg Address. It's called the Second Reply to Hayne. It was on the floor of the U.S. Senate. It's a speech where Webster talked about liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable. These are the patriotic words that echoed in every American's mind, and now Lincoln is invoking them because in that same speech, Webster said this: "It is, sir, the people's Constitution, the people's government, made for the people, made by the people, and answerable to the people." Lincoln, according to his law partner, read and reread that speech in the newspapers and loved and admired it like most Americans. And now he is invoking it at the end of his speech. When Lincoln talked about a new birth of freedom, he's also evoking the memories of the men, the young men who sacrificed. And in this case, he might be evoking a specific young man named Bayard Wilkinson, whose father, Samuel Wilkinson, was a reporter for the New York Times who wrote a stirring dispatch about the battle that he wrote next to the body of his dead son on July 4th, 1863, after he discovered that his eldest born had died on the first day of the battle. And at the end of this stirring dispatch, Sam Wilkinson had written for the New York Times, "O you dead at Gettysburg, who have baptized with your blood a second birth of freedom in America, how you are to be envied." That second birth of freedom in America, as part of the Wilkinson dispatch, is probably what Lincoln is evoking here. We can't prove these things necessarily. Lincoln doesn't talk about them, but he knew the Wilkinsons. The story was incredibly well known. And regardless of Lincoln's exact intentions, one thing is clear about a great writer like Abraham Lincoln. In a short speech like this, 272 words, 10 sentences, the reason why it packs such weight and punch is because it evokes the memories of Webster and Wilkinson and others. The language is the language borrowed from the King James Bible and the Common Book of Prayer, from the great speeches of American political history, and from the recent thrilling dispatches from war correspondents. The structure is past, present, and future. The imagery is about the civic religion of America. There are no specifics here. This is not a policy speech, and it's not the typical memorial. Lincoln doesn't mention any of the heroes by name. He doesn't mention the word Union or Confederate or slavery or emancipation. In some ways, it's an abstract speech, but it doesn't feel lifeless or abstract because it is so evocative. And that's one reason why we need to read it closely and try to recapture some of the power of the speech that has endured in ways that probably nobody expected. I think there is a myth about this address that Lincoln thought it didn't scour well. But the truth is he worked hard on it, and you can tell from July of 63 until November of 63, he revised it, worked on it, plotted it. And then, of course, he kept revising and plotting it in the way that only he could do. The text of the Lincoln's Gettysburg Address that we have on the Lincoln Memorial is actually probably not the text that he delivered at Gettysburg on November 19th. It comes from a revised text that he had prepared about a year afterwards. Lincoln actually kept fixing the text of the address for up to a year after he delivered it. Small corrections, but one of the most notable differences between the speaking texts that we have, and there's some debate about which one he used, and the final text that he prepared as copies, the one that's on the wall of the memorial, is that the phrase "under God," that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, that phrase "under God" was added in the later drafts. Lincoln wanted it there, but he didn't have it there at first. And that opens up the final element of analysis here, which is, to what is Lincoln appealing as the higher power that's motivating all Americans? Is it God, morality? Is it patriotism? Is it a belief in the universal liberty and equality of man? Or is it about democracy, government of the people, by the people, for the people? This is what scholars debate, and this is what students need to decide for themselves when they read this document closely.